In most true crime stories, evil announces itself early. There are warning signs, red flags, something visibly wrong. But sometimes, danger doesn't knock on the door. It's already inside the house. Sitting at the table, smiling, being called by its first name. John Wayne Gacy didn't look like a monster. He looked trustworthy, helpful, familiar. And that is exactly why no one noticed when people started disappearing around him. Before we go any further, if you appreciate real cases told with depth, respect for the victims, and attention to the details most people overlook, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like. It helps Open Case Files continue uncovering stories the world tried to forget and failed. John Wayne Gacy was the kind of man communities admire. He greeted his neighbors, attended local events, got involved in politics, and always seemed willing to help. There was nothing about his appearance that raised immediate suspicion. He didn't live on the fringes of society. He was embedded in it, connected, present. He was the type of person you'd invite into your home without hesitation. In the 1970s, in the suburbs of Chicago, Gacy built a solid reputation. He worked as a contractor and hired young men for simple jobs, paying them in cash. For many teenagers, it was their first job. For parents, it felt like good fortune. A responsible adult offering honest work, guidance, and seemingly safety. In an era where community trust still existed, no one questioned him too closely. What almost no one knew or wanted to see was that John Wayne Gacy was living a double life. During the day, the respected citizen. At night, something entirely different. Not an isolated mistake. Not a single bad decision. But a pattern. Silent, controlled, repeated. There is something especially disturbing about danger disguised as normality. Gacy didn't hide in dark alleys or isolate himself from others. He hosted parties, laughed loudly, shook hands. He even dressed as a clown to entertain children at charity events. In photographs from the time, he appears relaxed, smiling, comfortable in front of cameras, like a man no one would ever imagine being associated with fear. What makes this case truly horrifying isn't just what he did, but how long he was able to do it without being stopped. People vanished. Families searched for answers. Friends noticed sudden silences, but the pieces never came together fast enough to point directly at him. Because Gacy was trusted, and when someone is trusted enough, questions stop being asked. Some of the young men who worked for him mentioned strange behavior, uncomfortable jokes, situations that crossed invisible lines, but nothing that, on its own, sounded like a clear alarm. And that is the key. John Wayne Gacy didn't act recklessly. He tested boundaries, watched reactions, pulled back when necessary, moved forward when silence followed. Meanwhile, his public life remained untouched. He attended meetings, made political connections, and reinforced an image that functioned almost like armor. Man so involved, so visible, couldn't possibly be hiding something this dark. At least, that's what everyone believed. Police received scattered reports: a young man last seen heading to work, another who never returned home. But disappearances at the time weren't always treated urgently. Young men ran away, had family conflicts, left town voluntarily. That assumption, repeated too often, created the perfect space for something far worse to continue unchecked. What separates this case from many others isn't just the number of victims, but the proximity. Gacy didn't hunt strangers in distant places. He pulled people close, into his circle, into his home. He turned trust into a tool, normality into a weapon. Gradually, the environment around him began to change. Strange smells coming from the house, unsettling comments, coincidences that stopped feeling like coincidences. Still, nothing was enough to completely shatter the image he had built. Because when someone has spent years being known as the good guy, the idea that he could be something else feels too extreme to accept quickly. This is the point where many people ask, how did no one notice? But that question carries a dangerous illusion, the belief that we would have noticed, that we would have been different. The truth is, John Wayne Gacy thrived precisely because he didn't look dangerous, because he fit in, because he was liked, because he was trusted. And while the city continued its routine, while families slept believing they were safe, something grew in silence. A secret buried not only beneath the house, but beneath the collective denial of an entire community. Now, one yet knew exactly what was happening, but something was deeply wrong, and it was about to surface in a way that could no longer be ignored. By the end of 1978, something fundamental began to shift around John Wayne Gacy. For years, disappearances had occurred quietly. Boys vanished, families mourned, and the city absorbed the losses without connecting the dots. Each case was treated as an isolated tragedy, a runaway, a bad crowd, a life that drifted off course. That assumption protected Gacy more than any disguise ever could. But patterns do not remain hidden forever. They accumulate weight, and eventually, they collapsed. The disappearance of Robert Pius was different from the others, not because it was more violent, but because it was impossible to ignore. Robert was 15 years old, responsible, known, loved. On December 11, 1978, he went to a pharmacy in Des Plaines to speak with a contractor about a potential job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Witnesses later remembered the interaction. Clearly, Gacy smiled. He talked about work. He appeared professional, confident, trustworthy. Robert left with him, and then he vanished. When Robert failed to come home, his family reacted immediately. There was no waiting period, no assumption that he would return on his own. His mother pressed the police relentlessly. She demanded action. She demanded answers. And unlike so many families before her, she refused to be quiet. That pressure forced investigators to look closely. And once they did, they found themselves circling the same name again and again. John Wayne Gacy. At first, questioning Gacy felt routine. He had been questioned before in other contexts. He knew how to present himself: calm, cooperative, friendly. He invited officers into his home, offered coffee, spoke openly. He explained that Robert had left the pharmacy with him but had departed shortly after. His story was clean, simple, almost too simple. But this time, something felt off. Detectives noticed inconsistencies, minor details that shifted between conversations, timelines that didn't quite align. Nothing that could stand alone as proof, but enough to keep them from walking away. When they began checking Gacy's background, the picture darkened further. A prior conviction, complaints, rumors that had never solidified into charges. Red flags that, taken together, suggested a man who had been overlooked far too many times. Surveillance was initiated. Officers followed Gacy quietly. They watched his routines. They listened. And what they saw disturbed them. Gacy appeared increasingly anxious. He drove erratically. He watched his mirrors. He seemed aware that something was closing in. The polished image he had maintained for years was beginning to crack under the pressure. A search warrant was obtained for his house. The home itself appeared ordinary at first glance. A modest suburban residence, clean floors, normal furniture, no obvious signs of struggle or violence. But almost immediately, investigators noticed the smell. It was faint, but persistent. A heavy odor that clung to the air. Gacy dismissed it, casually, blaming sewage issues, dampness, even dead animals beneath the house. Explanations delivered smoothly, as if rehearsed. Experienced officers knew better. As the search continued, items began to emerge that could no longer be explained away. Handcuffs, ropes, personal belongings that didn't seem to belong to one individual. Objects that suggested restraint, control, confinement. Still, without bodies, the case remained fragile. Suspicion alone was not enough. What followed was perhaps the most unsettling phase of the investigation. Gacy began inserting himself into it. He followed officers, showed up at police stations without being asked questions about the progress of the case, offered theories, provided unsolicited information. It was behavior that crossed the line from cooperation into obsession. Detectives later described the sensation as being watched by the very person they were watching. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted. Investigators began to speak openly about the possibility they were dealing with a serial killer. Not a single crime, not an isolated incident, but a pattern of repeated violence hidden beneath normalcy. The idea was almost unthinkable. And yet, the evidence was pointing in one direction. Eventually, attention turned beneath the house. The Crawl space was accessed reluctantly. It was narrow, dark, and suffocating. As officers entered, the smell intensified immediately. There was no longer any doubt about its source. Digging began. And then, the unthinkable happened. Human remains were discovered. Then another, and another, layer upon layer, buried beneath the very place where Gacy slept at night, where he hosted guests, where neighbors laughed and children passed by without fear. The scale of the discovery grew rapidly. What had once been a missing persons case transformed into one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. Investigators worked methodically, cataloging remains, marking locations, attempting to preserve dignity where none had been given. Each discovery confirmed a reality more disturbing than the last. This was not impulsive violence. This was systematic, deliberate, planned, and it had continued for years without interruption. Gacy was arrested shortly afterward. During interrogation, the transformation was immediate. The friendly contractor vanished. In his place sat someone detached, almost bored. He spoke about his actions with chilling distance. At times, he minimized them. At others, he deflected responsibility entirely. He claimed some victims were not his, suggested others had died accidentally. Anything to fragment the truth and dilute accountability. As the excavation continued, the count rose. Victims were identified where possible. Families were notified. Phone calls were made that would permanently alter lives. For many, the pain was compounded by realization their sons had been close. They had trusted the wrong person. The community was forced into a reckoning. How had this happened? How had someone so visible, so involved, so seemingly harmless, managed to hide something so monstrous? Neighbors replayed memories endlessly. Conversations, smiles, handshakes, invitations. Everything felt tainted in hindsight. And yet, even as the bodies were recovered, even as the scope of the crimes became undeniable, the story was far from over. Because what remained was not just the question of how many were killed, but how society itself had failed to see what was directly in front of it. When John Wayne Gacy's crimes were finally exposed to the public, the shock moved faster than the investigation ever had. Newspapers struggled to find language strong enough. Television anchors hesitated before reading the numbers out loud. The idea that dozens of young men had vanished into the home of a respected businessman felt unreal, almost fictional. But this was not a distant horror. This was suburban America. Quiet streets, familiar faces, the kind of place where people believed monsters could not exist. The trial that followed was not merely a legal process. It became a national confrontation with denial. From the moment Gacy entered the courtroom, he presented himself not as a killer, but as a victim. He smiled. He joked. He behaved as if the proceedings were an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. His defense strategy centered on insanity, arguing that he was not responsible for his actions, that another personality had committed the crimes, that he himself was somehow separate from the bodies found beneath his floor. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified about encounters that now carried a chilling weight. Former employees described strange behavior. Survivors recounted moments where they had come terrifyingly close to becoming victims themselves. Experts explained patterns of manipulation, control, and psychological domination. Slowly, methodically, the image Gacy had constructed for decades collapsed in front of the jury. Perhaps the most disturbing element was not what was revealed, but what was already known. Gacy had not lived in secrecy. He had lived in plain sight. He had attended community events. He had hosted parties. He had photographed himself dressed as a clown, performing at hospitals and charity functions, embodying joy, laughter, innocence. That contrast burned itself into the public consciousness. The idea that someone who symbolized happiness could harbor such darkness became one of the most enduring and unsettling aspects of the case. The media fixated on this duality. Headlines labeled him the killer clown. Images of his painted face appeared alongside crime scene reports. And while the nickname captured attention, it also risked simplifying something far more complex. Gacy was not a monster from a nightmare. He was a man who exploited trust, authority, and social blind spots. That was the true horror. As the trial progressed, Families of the victims filled the courtroom. Some stared at Gacy in silence. Others could not bring themselves to look at him at all. Their grief did not resemble outrage. It was quieter, heavier, a weight that no verdict could lift. For many, this was not about justice. It was about acknowledgement or proof that their sons had existed, that they mattered, that they were not forgotten. The jury deliberated carefully. But the outcome was inevitable. John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the legal process. But it did not end the story. In the years that followed, Gacy remained disturbingly visible. He gave interviews. He wrote letters. He painted. His artwork, often featuring clowns, was sold, collected, debated. Some saw it as a grotesque curiosity, others as an insult. To the victims, the question lingered: why did society continue to give attention to those who had taken so much? Gacy himself never fully accepted responsibility. His accounts shifted constantly. He claimed innocence. He blamed accomplices, contradicted earlier statements. Even as execution approached, he maintained a narrative where he was misunderstood rather than monstrous. That refusal to fully confess left lingering questions, not about his guilt, but about the precise scope of his crimes. Were there more victims? Some investigators believed so. The number officially confirmed may never reflect the full reality. Several disappearances were never conclusively linked. Records were incomplete. Time had erased details. Families were left with uncertainty instead of answers. And uncertainty, in many ways, is the most cruel outcome of all. In 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed. There was no dramatic final statement, no revelation, no clarity. Just an ending that felt smaller than the damage he had caused. Outside the prison, reactions were mixed. Some felt relief. Others felt nothing at all. Because when crimes reach this scale, punishment rarely feels proportional. There is no symmetry between harm and consequence. What remained was a cultural scar. Gacy's case permanently altered how America understood serial violence. It exposed failures in policing and social assumptions, and the way certain victims were quietly dismissed because they were young, ill, or seen as disposable by society. It forced a reckoning with the idea that danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it runs for local office. Sometimes it lives next door. Even decades later, the story refuses to settle. Books continue to be written. Documentaries revisit the evidence. Psychologists analyze his behavior. And yet, the central questions remain unresolved. Not about how he did it, but how he was allowed to do it for so long. How warning signs were overlooked. How trust was exploited repeatedly without intervention. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: John Wayne Gacy did not succeed because he was invisible. He succeeded because he was visible, and no one wanted to imagine what that visibility could hide. This is why these stories matter, not because they sensationalize violence, but because they expose patterns. They remind us that evil is rarely obvious, that it thrives in complacency, that it depends on silence, assumptions, and the belief that this couldn't happen here. As you reflect on this case, consider not only the man at the center of it, but the system around him, the missed chances, the ignored warnings, the lives that might have been saved if someone had looked closer, asked harder questions, or trusted their instincts sooner. And now, the question remains with you. If something like this could happen there in that place, at that time, what does that say about how we see the world today? If you want more long-form true crime stories told with depth, respect, and darkness, stories that don't rush, don't soften the truth, and don't let uncomfortable questions fade, subscribe to Open Case Files. New episodes are coming, and some cases are far from closed.